Okay, so good evening and welcome to this latest chapter in the York Festival Ideas Extravaganza. My name is Tim Doran. I work in health policy at the University of York and I'm your host. And if you're familiar with online talks at the festival, you'll know the house rules by now, but I'll just explain them to those new to the format. You should hopefully be able to see a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can post your questions there at any time. And when we get to the Q&A section after Kyle's talk, I'll pick out the ones that I like to put to him, but please don't get offended if I don't ask your question, as we may get quite a few. I'll try to get through as many as I can. If you have any technical issues, you can just log out and use the original link to rejoin the session. And the session is going to be recorded, so you can watch it back later at your leisure. Finally, if you want to see subtitles, if you click the CC live transcript button, which should also be at the bottom of your screen. So our speaker tonight is Kyle Harper. He's Professor of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. He's written a number of books that explore historical issues of mortality and morality, including The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, and From Shame to Sin, the Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality in Late Antiquity. And we're very fortunate to have Kyle joining us on the summer solstice to talk about his impressively chunky book here, Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Course of Human History. It's a fascinating exploration of no less than the whole of human history, drawing insights from everything from old-fashioned history to brand new genetic science. And tonight, Carl will tell us how humanity's uniquely dangerous disease pool is rooted in our evolutionary past and why its growth has been accelerated by technological progress. So, Kyle, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. I appreciate the kind introduction. Thank you to the York Festival of Ideas and its organizers and sponsors for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm hoping that you're seeing my shared screen now. I'll trust that you are and trust that somebody will tell me if you're not. Again, thank you. Thank you for the invitation, to the organizers, supporters, and all the people who've worked hard to make this very rich Festival of Ideas a reality. I would like to start by saying that I am one of the very newest members in a very inexclusive global club. As of about 8 p.m. Last night, for the first time, I learned that I am now a COVID-19 patient. So after running from this plague and observing all the guidance possible for 2 years, it has at last and perhaps somewhat inevitably caught up to me. So I'm very thankful for modern science and for vaccines, which have helped to make this a very mild case. And I'm going to power through, but if I'm lacking a little bit of energy, or if I say anything you disagree with, then it's just, of course, the COVID-19 that I have. I started this book, Plagues Upon the Earth, 3 or 4 years before the COVID-19 outbreak. I'm by training a Roman historian and became very interested in the history of health, the history of infectious disease, and the role that infectious diseases play in my particular little area of the past. And I got so fixated and fascinated by the role of infectious diseases in human history that I decided I wanted to zoom out and write a big global history of infectious disease from the very beginning down to the present, which was supposed to be the first SARS outbreak or the threats of Ebola and so on. But of course, in the midst of writing it, the evolution of a new viral disease rocked our world and has continued to rock our world and to reshape the experience that we have day to day of health and disease. So this was not conceived as a COVID book, but it ended up, of course, being written in the shadow of COVID and still now presented in the shadow of COVID. I am a historian, but a historian that very much believes in what the now, unfortunately, late biologist E.O. Wilson called consilience, borrowing a term from a historian of science that means really the leaping together of knowledge, the assimilation of knowledge from different domains, from the natural sciences, the social sciences, from the humanities. And as a historian, I think we have so much to learn by working with scientists and scholars in other fields, whether it's archaeology or the natural sciences, more broadly. And particularly if we're thinking about the history of something like infectious disease, it's inevitable that we need to partner with and learn from experts who are working in things like microbiology or genetics, as well as allied fields like bioarchaeology, bioanthropology, that have the potential to teach us genuinely new things about the human past and human experience of disease. And the reason why is that as a historian, we're trained usually to work with written documents, with traditional kinds of archival evidence, with histories and chronicles, with other kinds of written sources. But that's only one way of learning about the past. And particularly if we want to understand the deeper past, we have to complement that with other kinds of material evidence. And that includes archaeological evidence, as well as the evidence of DNA. Genomic evidence, DNA, is a kind of historical archive that tells us the evolutionary history of different organisms that exist and have existed on Earth, including ourselves, the other animals, plants, and microbes with whom we share the planet. And one of the areas where we're particularly learning about the history of human health and disease comes from the advent of this really radical new kind of historical archive that tells us about the backstory of some of our most important diseases. So today I'm going to try and give a very broad overview of the big picture story of human relationships with infectious disease. And in doing so, I think you'll see that I try and draw upon genetic evidence that can tell us about the backstory of pathogens like the bubonic plague bacterium, like cholera, like measles, and other familiar diseases that have a past, an evolutionary past, that was often until really only the last decade or so quite shadowy, and that is slowly starting to come to light. So it's a kind of history that weaves together traditional documentary-based evidence, written sources, with new kinds of scientific evidence like DNA that can work together to help us build a richer picture of the human experience of infectious disease. Now, one thing I find unexpected about being a historian of infectious disease in the time of COVID is that people know a lot more than they did 2 years ago about infectious disease. So you don't have to spend a lot of time talking about things like variants and the basics of immunity. These have unfortunately become a part of our everyday vocabulary. But I still find that it helps me, at least, to lay out a few of the biological basics of infectious disease. Infectious disease is a state of impaired health that's caused by an invasive organism. So you can think of causes of human disease in really two broad categories: infectious and non-infectious. In the modern world, most people die of non-infectious causes. In developed societies, people die of chronic conditions, of cardiovascular disease, of cancer, of other kinds of degenerative and organ diseases. Whereas throughout most of the human past, most people, most of the time, died of infectious causes. So diseases that are caused by some kind of generally microbiological invader from a huge variety of different biological categories. So humans suffer from infectious diseases caused by a really remarkable array of different kinds of organisms, including viruses that cause diseases, of course, like COVID-19, but also measles, AIDS, yellow fever, and a whole host of other infections. Bacterial agents, tiny single-celled organisms without organized nuclei that cause a range of important diseases, especially gastroenteric diseases, but also diseases like the bubonic plague. Protozoa, single-celled organisms that are closer to animals in the tree of life. They have an organized nucleus and that are responsible for a relatively small number of human infectious diseases, although the ones that they cause tend to be responsible for an inordinate amount of human suffering and death, most notably of all malarial diseases. And then multi-celled organisms, worms, that are parasitic on humans as well as other animals and cause a wide range of often very important diseases. So this is a story with a wide range of a cast of characters, all of whom face certain common evolutionary challenges. And the most basic challenge that any parasite, microparasite, has is how to get from one host to the next. And so another way to think about the basics of infectious disease is to recognize that they only have a few ways to get from one host, one human body, to the next. A very small number of diseases can transmit via skin contact. A larger number of diseases and a number of particularly virulent diseases are spread by vectors, that is, by animal intermediaries, mostly, but not only mosquitoes, that can take microbes from one host to the next. So I mentioned malaria. It's a good example of a vector-borne disease that's spread by certain species of Anopheles mosquitoes. And then a number of important human infectious diseases. Most of them are either transmitted via the fecal oral route or the respiratory route. So they're transmitted in the waste matter of one host and manage to enter in the digestive canal of the next host, generally through, for instance, the contamination of water supplies or food supplies with fecal waste, or the respiratory route from the respiratory tract of one victim to the respiratory tract of the next, as is, of course, the case with diseases like influenza, the common cold, or COVID-19. And then a relatively small number of diseases that have solved the evolutionary puzzle of sexual transmission, including, of course, syphilis and AIDS, bacterial and viral disease, respectively. And finally, pathogens are pervasive in nature. They are moving between hosts, within species, and between species. Human health is situated within ecosystems that are comprised of really the entirety of the animal world. And so we're constantly switching, pathogens are constantly switching hosts, both transiently and sometimes more permanently, between different species, between domesticated animals and ourselves, between wild animals and ourselves, and of course, between wild and domesticated species. So ultimately, it seems likely that the virus responsible for COVID-19 is of zoonotic origin, probably a deep evolutionary history with certain kinds of small mammals like bats that either directly or through some other yet uncertain intermediary adapted to the human host and became then a permanently human disease. So it now transmits permanently among human populations, but of course is also still moving between wild animals as reservoirs and as semi-permanent hosts. So COVID-19 is interesting as one example among many of diseases that are primarily a human disease, but that also circulate over long time periods in wild animals. And it's one reason why COVID-19 is unlikely ever to be completely eradicated. So if the book that I've written has one big storyline, and if there's one thing that I think the history of infectious disease can help us as citizens of the 21st century and as citizens, global citizens in a time of pandemic, it is that human diseases are a product of our history. And why this matters is because we might carry around somewhere in the back of our minds the idea that infectious diseases are a kind of normal part of the pre-modern human past that we, thanks to modern science and public health, have managed to largely overcome. And so diseases like COVID-19 are, in a sense, an anomaly, an exception to the historical pattern. I think that narrative, while there are some true elements, really misses the fundamental shape of the story. In fact, humans have a truly unnatural roster of infectious diseases. And the reason why we have such an extraordinary number and such extraordinary virulent infectious diseases is because of our history, because of our past, because of the human story. And what I'd like to emphasize today is that the triumph in modern times that has brought the burden of infectious disease so largely under control relative to the past is in some ways an even more remarkable achievement than we might realize, because human progress, in a sense, population growth, technological advance, and connectivity has made the threat of infectious diseases even greater throughout our past. So there wasn't some kind of timeless pre-modern disease pool that we then overcame. In fact, as human societies have expanded and grown and become more interconnected, the number and virulence of diseases we face has become progressively more and more challenging. And so the human control of infectious disease in modern times, which is always imperfect, is achieved against the backdrop of a very dynamic and, in fact, ever worsening threat of infectious disease. And so what I'm going to do today is, in very rapid fashion, overview some of the main lines of the story of the way in which human progress, in a sense, population growth, technological advance, greater prosperity, and connectivity have created the ecological and evolutionary conditions for human societies to face an unnatural burden of infectious disease. And this is a story that goes back really to the very beginning of Homo sapiens, some 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. and has unfolded over the course of our very long history and has been inflected at certain crucial moments of technological change, from the transition from foraging to farming at the beginning of the Neolithic, from the rise of large interconnected states and empires in largely the Iron Age 5,000 years ago or so, the rise of transatlantic sail that reconnected the hemisphere in modern times, and then the acceleration of industrialization and fossil energy driven transport in modern times. So there are different ways we could think about construing this story. One of the most important themes, and I think one that can resonate with us today, is the theme of globalization. That is the historical process by which different human populations or human societies come into greater contact and reliance and connectivity. We might think of globalization as a modern phenomenon, and of course, it's been greatly accelerated in the last generation or two by modern telecommunication and transportation. But really, globalization is a much deeper story with many different chapters and phases in which human populations have become more interconnected. And in a sense, the long history of globalization is also the long history of the way in which infectious diseases, as microparasites, have taken advantage of, have parasitized human success and human connectivity. And so what I'll do is give some very brief examples of the ways in which pulses of globalization, so transitional moments when human societies have come into greater integrated dependence, have also fostered the transmission of new circuits, or the creation of new circuits for the transmission of is, in this sense, very old, and in fact it's prehistoric in the sense that it is a developmental process that goes back even deeper than written historical records, to 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, at least, to the pre-Bronze Age, to a time when human societies started to become more interconnected through the rise of greater transportation technologies, like, of course, the domestication of the horse, or we could think also of the invention of the wheel, which facilitated greater trade, commercial links, larger scale conflict, that also fostered the spread of infectious diseases. One of the really interesting discoveries to come out of archaeogenetics, or the study of DNA material recovered from archaeological contexts, has concerned the pathogen that causes the disease plague, the plague, meaning the disease bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis. It was completely unknown to historians that bubonic plague was in fact a prehistoric disease that goes back at least to the Bronze Age in Eurasia. But this is now something that, thanks to DNA evidence that has helped to identify very early specimens of the Yersinia pestis genome from Bronze Age Eurasia, that we now know has been a part of the human past for thousands of years. Now, plague is a very distinctive disease in human history. As someone who has worked on the history of disease, I find the bubonic plague as a specific disease to be one of the most mind-boggling diseases, one of the most mind-boggling phenomena in all of nature. Its destructive power is simply extraordinary, and the role that it's played in the human past is, I think, really unmatched by any other disease, in the sense, not that it's killed the most humans, that honor probably goes to a disease like tuberculosis or malaria, but as a disease which has caused the most explosive outbreaks known to recorded history. It's such an extraordinary disease biologically for a few reasons. One, it is not a disease that adapts to the human host. So it is a disease that is and remains zoonotic. It is really a disease of wild rodents that circulates permanently in wild rodent populations. And unlike virtually all of the other really famous diseases of human history, malaria, tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, and so on, it's a disease that never evolves, never adapts in the evolutionary sense, the ability to transmit permanently between human populations. It always relies on wild animal reservoirs. So it's a wild animal disease that from time to time is spilled over into human populations. And the other thing that makes it so fascinating biologically is that it's a vector-borne disease that relies on fleas primarily for its transmission. Vector-borne diseases tend to be exceptionally virulent for some basic evolutionary reasons. They're able to transmit between hosts, even if the original host is made extremely sick and decapacitated very early on in the sickness. The ability to transmit via a vector allows the disease to find a new host anyway. And the plague bacterium seems to have evolved a particularly nefarious ability to control fleas and to turn them into kind of infection transmitting zombies that wildly bite new hosts and transmit the bacterium. So plague is a really distinctive disease in that sense. And that's also why it's such an ecologically complex disease. To cause outbreaks in human populations requires the disease to move between multiple hosts, from a wild rodent host like social burrowing rodents such as marmots and gerbils, into other hosts that live in closer proximity to humans. Most importantly of all, probably the black rat, a commensal rodent that lives in and around human settlements. And from black rats to human populations, probably the most important mechanism of transmission is through black rat populations and then to humans, although plague is such a versatile disease that it can transmit between humans either via a respiratory route or through human ectoparasites, although as I mentioned, it can't transmit permanently between human populations. So plague outbreaks are really extraordinary natural events. And the plague is considered such a notorious disease because it causes a horrific deadly disease with very distinctive diagnostic signs, most notably of all bubonic plague, which is a course of disease characterized by hard pustular swellings that appear at the site of infected lymph nodes in the groin, the armpits, the knees, or the neck. And are responsible for the most visible and characteristic expression of the disease. As we'll see in a moment, this is a disease that has caused repeated pandemics in human history, but as I said, we now know goes back to the prehistoric period, to a time when Eurasian societies are becoming more interconnected as the horse is domesticated, as societies across the steppe and in the settled agricultural world to the south are becoming more interdependent and coming into greater conflict. The plague is now a part of that story. And we know that even though we didn't a few years ago, thanks to archaeogenetics. Okay, I'm going to get a drink. Excuse me for that. Second pulse of globalization that I'd like to discuss is the Iron Age globalization. And as a historian, I'm biased. This is the period of the past that is nearest and dearest to my heart, that sees the rise of great empires across the old world. And with the rise of these larger cities, these larger states and empires, comes greater long distance trade. And of course comes greater urbanization. I'm going to show a graphic that was published now almost 2 years ago in Science that is a little bit complicated, but I think tells a really amazing story of the way that diseases take advantage of human progress, and is also a shining example of the way that genetic evidence and traditional historical evidence can work together. Measles is one of the most important diseases in human history. It's a respiratory disease that caused a severe burden of mortality and morbidity in the past. It is not a very old disease, and this is the latest estimate of the emergence of measles virus, according to the time that it separates historically from its closest known relative, the rinderpest virus. And so on the top chart, the little red dot you see is an estimate of the divergence time between the measles virus and this cattle disease, rinderpest virus. As you can see, about 2,500 years ago, the two separate. This is interesting because the measles virus is so contagious that it requires a huge human population in order to sustain permanently within human societies. It's believed that the measles virus requires urban habitats of some 200,000 to 300,000 hosts in order to circulate permanently. What you see on the bottom chart are historical estimates of the largest urban populations in different historical regions over time on the same time chart as the plot above. And what you can see is that right about the time that human societies build cities in the Iron Age that are big enough for measles to transmit permanently in human populations, the virus adapts to the human host. So this is a really striking example of consilience of what we might expect in evolutionary terms, that the measles virus requires certain kinds of human populations in order for it to be able to adapt to the human host. And sure enough, it looks from the genetic evidence that this is when the measles virus becomes a specialist in infecting humans and separates from the ancestor that it shared with the cattle focused rinderpest virus. So this is a really, I think, striking example of the way that human progress, the technological and political progress that allowed humans, societies to build enormous cities, such as existed in the Mediterranean in the Iron Age, cities like Rome, were exploited, were parasitized by microbes that took advantage of new kinds of connectivity within human populations. So the measles virus is an important example and a major human disease whose history was really murky, but is slowly starting to be teased together thanks to this new kind of evidence. One of the really consequential phases of globalization is what we think of as the late Middle Ages, which was a very cosmopolitan and interconnected world in the old world, Africa, Eurasia, in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And one of the diseases that famously took advantage of this connectivity was, again, the bubonic plague. After centuries when the historical record doesn't provide clear indications of major pandemic outbreaks of the bubonic plague, suddenly in the middle of the 14th century, there's a continuous record from much of Eurasia for widespread and devastating outbreaks of bubonic plague. This time, of course, is what we call the Black Death that reached the Mediterranean and Europe in the 1340s and spread widely over much of the old world, taking advantage of Silk Road connectivity, of the Mongol world that had been created in the aftermath of the conquest of Genghis Khan. This is, of course, one of the most famous episodes of the history of human disease. And as a historian of disease, I still would maintain that the kind of traditional, conventional horror that we associate with this disease outbreak is not misplaced. This is, in fact, one of the most stunning biological events in human history that wiped out an enormous percentage of the population over vast areas. It's still believed that across much of Europe, as much as half the population was wiped away in the space of only a few years. So having lived through the disruption of COVID, we can imagine what kind of societal consequences were entailed in losing such an enormous part of the population. Excuse me. And I'll only add as a quick footnote that this is another disease outbreak where we're learning an enormous amount from the genetic evidence. Yersinia pestis as a pathogen is the most widely studied pathogen by archaeogeneticists, and we're continuing almost every month to learn something new. I'll flag only a few days ago, there was a blockbuster paper published by the same group that, mostly the same group that I showed the Bronze Age plague paper from, the first author, Maria Spirou, elucidating the origins of the Black Death in the 14th century. So it's a really exciting time because we're learning things about even some of the most well-studied outbreaks in the historical record, as the Black Death is, and we still have really new things to learn about even the most notorious and familiar disease events. So if the Black Death can and should be considered as a kind of part of the experience of connectivity and globalization in the late Middle Ages. I think it's perhaps even easier to argue that the crossing of the Atlantic in 1492 and the reintegration of the old and new world registers as one of the most important, one of the most pivotal moments in the long history of globalization. This is the beginning of what was famously called the Columbian Exchange, explored by Alfred Crosby and William McNeill, which is holistically considered a biological exchange of people, of plants, of pests, including microbes across the old world and new, going in both directions. And of course, a very important part of this exchange involves the transfer of microbial pathogens from the old world to the new and from the new world to the old. Although here too is an area where we're learning a lot that was unknown to historians like William McNeill working a generation ago. And just to highlight quickly a few of the kind of major findings. One is that this graphic that's very nice from Rice University is probably outdated. It does seem that syphilis was not brought from the New World to the Old, but was in fact present and has been recovered from archaeological specimens in Europe prior to the crossing of the Atlantic by Columbus. So this seems to be helping to resolve an old debate about the origins of syphilis, and probably militates strongly against the hypothesis that it was imported to Europe from the New World. What does seem certain is that the balance of the diseases exchanged in the 16th century was highly unequal, that Europeans carried to the New World a far greater number and far more virulent infectious diseases to the New World than was the reverse. And the most important, although far from the only infectious disease that was transmitted, was smallpox. Now, another interesting thing that we're learning about smallpox is that the smallpox virus in its modern form is not a tremendously old pathogen. And so smallpox was, in a sense, a kind of new disease everywhere in the world in the 16th century, broadly speaking. And so shouldn't be considered a kind of the introduction of smallpox into the New World can't be considered in isolation from the fact that this is a pathogen that seems to have evolved to become more virulent and spreads all over from Ming China to Mexico City more visibly and more virulently in the 16th century. And finally, I'd also call attention to the still somewhat underrated importance of the transmission of specifically tropical diseases from the old world to the new world. So diseases that are very climatically and environmentally sensitive, like malaria and yellow fever, that are dependent largely on different vectors of mosquitoes for their transmission, and are transmitted, we now know, again, settling old debates, thanks to genetic evidence from the old world to the new world following the crossing of the Atlantic, and imposing a massive new burden of disease on the new world, and imposing a geographically highly uneven burden of disease in the new world tropics. And I think the interplay between the burden of infectious disease and the rise of plantation economies in the New World and the spread of the slave trade and slavery in the New World kind of nefariously go hand in hand. The second to last pulse of globalization is the 19th century development of steam-driven, of fossil fuel-driven transport in the form of steamships and railroads. Really, for the first time, human transportation was liberated from its reliance on the speed of human travel, the speed of horses, the speed of wind-driven sail, and was now propelled by a new source of energy. And people in the 19th century recognized that accelerating transmission and greater global connectivity had helped to facilitate the transmission of infectious diseases further and faster than ever before. And the really signal example of this is the spread of cholera, a very important human disease that, again, is a very modern disease. It's a bacterial disease that is spread via fecal oral transmission. It causes very acute, rapid, and very severe disease that leads to rapid dehydration and can be extremely fatal if it's not quickly treated. It spreads on new routes of rail and steamship transportation in the 19th century. We know, thanks to its genome, that the pandemic lineage, the highly virulent cholera responsible for the modern pandemics, is not a tremendously old disease. It only evolves in the last few centuries. And in a sense, we can see this as a conjunction of the biology of a pathogen, once again, taking advantage of human progress, of human connectivity, of human trade, of globalization to exploit us. And of course, cholera, in a sense, is the most famous, the most notorious disease of the 19th century. It seems to have emerged in the Ganges Delta and quickly to have spread worldwide in several pulses. It's notable too that the experience of global cholera is in some ways the first global disease that's able to be tracked, perceived, communicated with modern forms of communication technology. And it's no accident that the experience of the cholera pandemics in the 19th century give rise to enormous fear, because it's possible to follow the transmission of the disease in ways that were not possible before 19th century connectivity and communication. And one really interesting signal of this is that it's thanks to cholera and new communications technologies that in the later part of the 19th century, the word pandemic comes to have its modern sense of a disease outbreak of global or intercontinental scale. So by the 1880s and 1890s, the word pandemic comes to mean what it means to us today, a global disease outbreak. And it's very much driven by cholera, which in turn is very much able to take advantage of 19th century systems of globalization built on new forms of transportation technology. So all of the diseases that I've talked about so far are examples in pre-modern times of how diseases take advantage of human connectivity. But I'd close by emphasizing that even over the last generation or two, the rapid acceleration of global connectivity, thanks to new forms of trade and transportation, we can take symbolic of these changes, the advent of widespread civilian aviation, the form of jet travel that has connected global populations like never before. And so the evolution of infectious diseases not only doesn't stop when human societies develop modern biomedicine, interventions like vaccines and antibiotics and other pharmaceuticals, public health interventions like, for instance, water treatment that has liberated humans from the suffering of infectious disease. But in a sense, over the same time horizon, the evolution of infectious disease has been incentivized. As humans have become more numerous, there are now nearly 8 billion of us. And as we become more interconnected, we've given our microbial parasites more incentive to evolve, to adapt the ability to take advantage of us than ever before. So we've had to run faster to stay ahead. And we only have to look to the coronavirus family to witness this. Here you see the 7 known major species of the coronavirus family that are adapted to infect humans, and a plot of the growth of human population numbers. As there are more humans, there are more human lungs, there are more human respiratory tracts like mine to take advantage of if you're a virus looking to hijack a cell and take it over in order to reproduce your genome. And in a sense, unsurprisingly, the spread of human hosts has provoked, as an evolutionary response, the adaptation of viruses to take advantage of us. This is only one example. I think we should fit any number of other human diseases into this framework, whether it's cholera, influenza, polio, AIDS, or the other diseases that have been threatening to become globally pandemic, like SARS-1, Ebola, Zika, and so on. SARS-2 that has erupted and destabilized our global society is anything but an anomaly. In fact, it is the strictest obedience to the laws of ecology and evolution and the patterns of human history. Let me close quickly with 2 thoughts. One is that evolution, of course, never stops. We were warned that this was coming. We've been warned for over a generation that emerging infectious diseases are incentivized by human population growth, by our agricultural practices, by the kinds of cities that we live in, and the kind of connectivity that we enjoy and benefit from, but that also facilitate the transmission of microbes. So COVID-19 was, in a sense, predictable. The specifics of it were not, but a pandemic like this one was inevitable. And of course, because the fundamental incentives remain there, this will not be the last pandemic. And finally, if the history of human disease can teach us something, it is that our health is globally interconnected. The great Victorian doctor who helped to identify the nature and causes of the great scourge, typhoid fever, I think said it best: the members of the great human family are bound together by 1,000 secret ties, of whose existence the world in general little dreams. And he that was never yet connected with his poorer neighbor by deeds of charity or love may one day find, when it is too late, that he is connected with him by a bond which may bring them both at once to a common grave. Globalization is a deep part of the human story. It's one of the fundamental features of the human past, and it's one of the fundamental parameters of human health and human disease. Thank you very much, and I hope for questions. I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, many thanks, Kyle. It was fantastic talk, and I think a great overview of the main themes of the books. And thank you for doing this as a sort of a meta presentation, as you're actually carrying the latest pandemic virus within your respiratory system. So I just want to start actually towards the end of what of your talk. I mean, you talked a lot about how infectious disease has essentially followed human progress as we've progressed to becoming a species that is ever more connected. And I wonder how much you thought that human progress has been driven by infectious disease. In other words, sort of putting it the other way around. And if so, you know, are there? Yeah. So Ellen has asked, what mistakes of the past can we learn from, and does progress ever work for us or just against us? So I wonder if you could sort of address those questions.
Right, great questions, big ones. And I think the shortest way to answer it is yes, infectious diseases have absolutely stimulated human progress. They've driven creativity, innovation, cooperation, political as well as technological progress. And I think that too is a very deep story that we shouldn't just sort of begin in modern times with you know, Edward Jenner and the rise of vaccination. But there's a deeper story of the way that human societies have tried to confront the challenges of health and disease. And so we can look to the ancient medieval times for cities that are trying to build sanitary regulations that maintain healthy and sanitary environments for their population well before germs are discovered or the microbiological causes of infectious diseases are really identified. In late medieval and early modern times, the bubonic plague is the single most terrifying threat to human health, and it inspires the strengthening of public health infrastructure and political power in the Mediterranean and Europe. Of course, it motivates political innovations like quarantine. In this sense, the isolation of ships for the canonical 40 days to disrupt the transmission of the disease in times of plague, which is in fact probably, this is still debated and explored, but it probably is one of the major factors in the control of bubonic plague in early modern times. So there's a backstory, but with that said, I would say as well that it's important to recognize that progress speeds up in the 18th century, in the time of the Enlightenment, time of experimentation, the time of doubting received dogmas and being willing to submit hypotheses to empirical testing. That's exactly what Edward Jenner does. He has a hypothesis about the way that the exposure to cowpox works. He tests it and it works. And the spread of vaccination is, his book's published in 1798. Vaccination spreads rapidly. It's maybe the single most important, it may be the single most important innovation in all of human history, not just in the history of health. It's our single greatest control over a huge range of diseases, particularly viral diseases. And then, of course, in the 19th century, the progress of germ theory, biomedicine, as well as public health, that continues to this day. And I'll say as well that I'm a historian, not a futurist, but I do think that when we have a little bit of distance from the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll see this pattern of the challenge of infectious disease driving human societies to innovate and discover technologies and political approaches to health. I think we'll see that the COVID-19 pandemic has spurred progress. I don't know if I'm optimistic politically, but certainly technologically. Look at the rapid acceleration of mRNA vaccines. I think we'll see that the huge investments in really basic virology, in different kinds of applied virology, the development of therapeutics, hopefully funding that's going into better disease surveillance. All of these, there's a lot of human brain power, probably an unprecedented concentration of human brain power going into the challenge of pandemics. And I think that will, in ways we can't yet completely perceive, we'll come to appreciate that the challenge of this pandemic has created new innovations, new technologies that will benefit future generations.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that again is partly, or if not largely, a matter of perception? I'm thinking, the aftermath of the Black Death here was quite a tough time for the church because it didn't seem to have answers for what was happening at the time, and if the scientific response to the coronavirus pandemic has not been as effective as it had. I'm thinking particularly in terms of development of vaccines, whether that would have sort of cast doubt in that area as well. So if you're seen to have a sort of success, a way of dealing with this, does that sort of drive where public support for particular approaches is derived from?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting line of thought. I do think that if you were going to kind of scour the records of the past, you would see that that times of really important pandemics have also been times when public trust in institutions has been called into question. And I think in ways, again, we might not fully yet perceive that whether it's scientific institutions or governments or other social institutions, the media, we do live in a kind of moment when there was a pre-existing crisis of public trust in certain ways that certainly the COVID-19 pandemic seems to have, at least from where I sit, maybe different for others, but seems to have only really seriously exacerbated public trust in certain institutions, which may ultimately be unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay, so got a question from Rebecca. Firstly, she hopes you feel better soon. And then she says that I was interested to hear smallpox described as a more recent disease. And I know smallpox has been suggested from Egyptian mummies and as a cause for the Antonine Plague. So do you think these were perhaps instead a form of measles or perhaps another infectious disease rather than smallpox?
Well, these are great questions, and they're very lively questions in the field at the moment, both for historians and for kind of archaeogenetics folks. And here's what's happened. In 2017, there was a major paper published that seemed to show that modern smallpox, which is a viral disease, back up just a little bit, modern smallpox is a viral disease, variole major. It's also one of the worst diseases in human history. So kind of any way you want to slice or dice that, it's one of the really, really bad ones. And we long kind of thought that it was an old disease, exactly for the reasons that the well-informed questioner asks. Sometimes said that there are mummified remains in Egypt that seem to have the kind of skin lesions characteristic of smallpox. There's a very, very important Roman disease outbreak starting in the 160s AD, known as the Antonine Plague, that 10 years ago, Roman historians, including myself, were fairly confident with smallpox. But then in 2017, there was a very important historical DNA paper published that had 17th century genome of smallpox, which is amazing in itself because smallpox, it's easier to get bacterial DNA than viral DNA. It's almost impossible to get really old RNA viruses. So we aren't really at the stage where we're going to start finding really old coronavirus, which is an RNA virus. But smallpox is a big double-stranded DNA virus. Still, it's an amazing accomplishment. It was recovered from the 17th century and showed that the modern lineage of variola major, this viral agent of smallpox, really seemed to have emerged only 400 or 500 years ago. That's actually weirdly consistent, maybe not weirdly, it's strikingly consistent with some arguments that some very savvy medical historians had already made, that smallpox seems to get really, really bad and visible in the 16th century. So I think it's now safe to say that something really big happens in the history of the variola virus in the 16th century or so that makes it an explosive disease, that makes it one of the worst diseases of human history. And that makes where did it come from? What are some of these earlier things? I've really been called into question. Well, only, I think it's 2 years ago now, another blockbuster paper was published that found a very closely related but extinct lineage of variola in early medieval skeletons from Northwestern Europe. So there were other kinds of smallpox relatives that were ancestral forms that have now gone extinct. So this is clearly going to be a pretty complicated story in which smallpox may have been adapting to humans in phases or in fits and starts. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, I still think, could have been an ancestral lineage of smallpox, but that's now quite speculative. And unless and until the DNA evidence comes to help, we won't really know. So it's a good example of the excitement, but also the challenge of learning. I think in 2017, I published a book where I was pretty confident that the Antonine Plague was an old form of smallpox. Today, I'd be much, much more hesitant to say that quite so in an unqualified way. But it's an area where we're learning a lot. Hopefully, we'll learn a lot more. But I do think it's pretty clear and pretty important that something really important happens in the evolutionary history of this pathogen only 500 or so years ago that makes it the modern terrifying form that we know.
Okay, I've got a question from Jared, and I know you said you don't necessarily want to be a futurist, but as a historian, how you think COVID might be memorialized? So do you think there might be physical memorials such as Eyam? Eyam is a village here in England in the Peak District, right, which where the people within the village took the decision to isolate, not to travel, to contain the plague within their village. And as you can imagine, most of them died off as a result, but it's become a sort of a living memorial to the people who did that. So do you see something similar happening around COVID, or how do you see that being memorialized?
It's a great question, but it is one that's hard for me to speak to, at least in any expert fashion. I will say my instincts are that I find quite striking how, and again, this may be conditioned by where I am and local factors, and if others have different experience or perception, I would not be surprised. I'd be interested. But but I am struck by how relatively little collective sense there is around the experience and the trauma of COVID. It's and maybe it has to do with the nature of American politics, and there's been some memorialization and some kind of solemnification in recognizing, the milestone deaths, but maybe it's something where societies need more time. I'm sure that as it gets processed, and there may be generational factors too. I think we have no way of knowing how people who are young today are going to really remember and memorialize this. But the human toll of this is so staggering. But I think when you look around, you don't yet see a very visible effort sort of galvanizing around public or collective memorialization. So I will say what we can learn from the past is that diseases get remembered in very weird and very unpredictable ways for usually for reasons that are hard to foresee, but are driven by different interests. And just to draw one example, the so-called Spanish flu at the end of the First World War was maybe 50 years ago in the 70s was sort of memory of it was revived, and it was sort of called the forgotten pandemic. Its death toll was truly staggering, and it really didn't sort of register in the kind of public, national, or global consciousness in the way that you would have predicted. And there are different reasons for that. People often sort of say that, coming out of the trauma of World War I, it was overshadowed, and there was sort of a desire to, in the Roaring Twenties, to move past the pain of the recent past. I don't know how much credibility that should have or not, but for whatever reason, major global pandemic that you don't very often find highly visible sort of memorializations. There's some, but not like the plague ones that you're talking about. So plagues get remembered in very, very weird ways, and it's obviously too soon to know how COVID's going to get memorialized.
Okay, so maybe a slightly related question. Etta asks, what you think the seventh aspect in your list of globalization and disease might be?
The seventh, the phases.
Yeah.
Well, when we terraform Mars and we move to Mars, we're obviously going to take our diseases with us. So it'll be interplanetary globalization. Wherever we go, our parasites will follow. I think it'd be hubris to think otherwise.
Yeah, and who knows what's lurking out there? Xenoparasites. Who knows?
Exactly.
So we're getting close to time. So I did want to just ask this question from Laura, and again, it's to try and get a sort of historian's perspective on this. How you think the advent of media, news channels, etc., from early newspapers to social media affects people's responses to pandemics and plagues, and have the recent changes been a good or a bad thing?
Well, we can start by recognizing that the perception of public health disasters and the technologies of perception and communication really are a fundamental ingredient in the experience. And when we think historically, the kinds of societies that I mostly have studied didn't have the technologies of perception or communication to really in real time track deaths and to talk about the reaction to plague. And I think when we do have more perspective on this, we will see that that the global experience of this pandemic really does differ from historical experiences because of the internet and social media. We all know the Johns Hopkins global heat map that I think a lot of us, particularly me, in the first months of the pandemic, the daily routine was to refresh the heat map and see where the cases were spreading. And if it wasn't that, it was something else. But there's never been a global pandemic where both the close perception based on relatively good information about the transmission of the virus, along with the global real-time messy conversation that is social media has been a dimension of it. So as a historian, I think one thing we can observe is that really is a difference. Sometimes there is something new under the sun. And 100 years ago in the Spanish influenza, there wasn't social media. And I think that the politics of the response, the public trust elements that we mentioned, social media is one of the core ingredients of that. And it's one where historians can help, but we also, maybe the best thing we can say is that this is something really new.
Okay. Well, we're coming up to time, so apologies for those those of you if I didn't get around to your question. I do appreciate the engagement, some excellent and very informed questions. So I just want to thank Kyle for an extremely engaging talk and for fielding those questions and listing many more. Really appreciate it, Carl, and I hope you've enjoyed your time. And I hope you're not feeling.
I did.
I hope you're not feeling too hoarse.
Feeling better already.
Yeah. So there's going to be a recording available on the festival YouTube channel. You'll be able to access from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 24th of June. You should be getting an email to notify you when the video is available. If you want to buy the book, and why wouldn't you, it's available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. You can find a link on the festival website or to go to foxlanebooks.co.uk. And with my corporate hat on, we really do hope you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival Ideas. You can find details on the website, yorkfestivalideas.com. If you're a Twitterer, you can post your thoughts about this and other events using hashtag York Ideas. And again, to Kyle, on behalf of everyone that you can't see in the audience, thank you very much and good night.